The night Karl-Anthony Towns made the NBA regret laughing. Before the basketball world could celebrate a championship, it had to answer for 11 years of disrespect. They called Karl-Anthony Towns soft. They called him an empty stat superstar. They said he could never handle real pressure, never anchor a contender, and never become the kind of player Kevin Garnett swore he would be. But under the brightest lights of the NBA Finals, with every camera pointed at Victor Wembanyama, KAT stepped into the moment and made the entire league look foolish. San Antonio was ready for a Wemby coronation. The arena, the cameras, the headlines, everything was built for the young giant everyone called the future. But across from him stood another 7-footer, one who had spent a decade being doubted, joked about, and pushed out of the superstar conversation. That night, Karl-Anthony Towns did not just play well. He changed the meaning of his entire career. He attacked the glass. He punished mismatches. He stretched the floor. He stayed composed when the pressure rose. And when the Knicks needed a grown man performance on the road, Towns delivered 21 points and 13 rebounds, becoming the first Knick since Dave DeBusschere in 1973 to record a 20-point double-double in a finals road game. That was not just a stat. That was history answering back. Because back in 2015, Kevin Garnett saw something in Towns that almost nobody else believed. He saw the footwork, the touch, the shooting, the mobility, but more than anything, he saw the fire. KG kept telling people this kid had something special inside him. He called him the future. He defended him through every joke, every bad headline, every playoff failure, and every soft label thrown his way. Most people laughed. Years later, those same people had no choice but to watch, as Towns became one of the biggest reasons New York reached the top of basketball again. Maybe KAT did not suddenly become different. Maybe the league simply took 11 years to understand what Garnett had seen from day one. If you're watching from New York, Minnesota, California, Texas, or anywhere else in the world, drop your city in the comments. If you think Kevin Garnett was right all along, comment 1. If you think Cat's championship finally silenced the critics, comment 2. And don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only getting started. Kevin Garnett saw what everyone else missed. Long before New York celebrated him, long before the finals changed his reputation, Karl-Anthony Towns was just a young #1 pick walking into Minnesota with the weight of a franchise on his shoulder. He had the size, the skill, the touch, and the resume. But talent alone never impresses Kevin Garnett. KG had seen talented players before. He had played with them, battled them, and outworked many of them. What caught his attention was different. Garnett saw how Towns listened. He saw how quickly the rookie absorbed information. He saw the way his feet moved for a 7-footer, the way his hands worked around the rim, the way his jumper forced defenses to think twice before leaving him. But more than anything, KG saw a hunger that reminded him of himself. Not the loud version people expected, not the screaming, chest-pounding version, but something deeper, a quiet obsession to get better. That was why Garnett kept saying the same thing. This kid was different. Around Minnesota, people heard him. Around the league, people ignored him. To most fans, it sounded like a proud veteran hyping up the rookie in his own locker room. But KG was not just being nice. He was warning everyone. He believed Towns had the tools to become one of the most complete big men basketball had ever seen. And early on, the signs were obvious. Towns won Rookie of the Year unanimously. He scored with ease. He rebounded like a machine. He shot from distance before most centers were comfortable living beyond the arc. He could punish smaller players inside and drag slower bigs away from the basket. On paper, the league had found the next great modern center. But basketball stories are never that simple. Minnesota was not ready to win right away. The roster kept changing. The pressure kept rising. Every impressive box score came with another loss that critics could use against him. And once the losing started to define the conversation, people stopped looking at what Towns was becoming and started judging him only by what the Timberwolves were not. That was when the gap began. Kevin Garnett saw growth. The public saw excuses. KG saw a future star learning the hard way. The critics saw a big man putting up numbers on a team that could not break through. And from that point on, every season became a battle between what Towns was actually building and what people wanted to believe about him. The soft label that would not go away. The cruelest part about Karl-Anthony Towns' reputation was that the numbers were never the problem. In fact, the numbers were almost too good to ignore. He was giving Minnesota elite production from the center position, scoring efficiently, rebounding consistently, and stretching the floor in ways that should have made him one of the league's most respected offensive weapons. But in the NBA, numbers do not always protect a player. Sometimes, they become the very thing people use against him. That is exactly what happened to KAT. Every big night was followed by the same response. Empty stats. Every dominant regular season stretch came with the same question. Where is the playoff success? Every time Minnesota fell short, the blame found its way back to Towns. It did not matter that the roster had flaws. It did not matter that the organization was still searching for stability. It did not matter that young stars rarely learn how to win overnight. The basketball world wanted a simple answer, and Towns became the easy target. Then came the word that followed him everywhere: soft. It appeared on debate shows. It showed up in comment sections. It became a punchline on podcasts. If Towns argued with officials, people said he lacked control. If he stayed calm, people said he lacked fire. If he put up 30 and lost, people said the stats did not matter. If he struggled, they said KG had been wrong all along. He was trapped inside a narrative where almost nothing he did could fully change the conversation. That kind of label is dangerous because once fans accept it, they start seeing everything through it. A missed defensive rotation becomes proof. A bad playoff game becomes evidence. A quiet interview becomes a personality flaw. Suddenly, the player is no longer judged as a full human being inside a complicated team situation. He becomes a symbol of everything people want to criticize. And still, Kevin Garnett kept defending him. KG understood something the critics did not want to admit. Development is not always clean. Great players do not all grow in the same environment, at the same speed, with the same support. Some need the right system. Some need the right teammate. Some need a coach who understands how to unlock them instead of forcing them into a role that does not fit. For years, Towns was not failing because he had no heart. He was stuck inside a story that refused to see the whole picture. When Minnesota stopped feeling like his team, the turning point in Minnesota did not happen in one single night. It happened slowly, piece by piece, until Karl-Anthony Towns looked around and realized the franchise he once carried no longer revolved around him. First came the expectations, then came the criticism. Then came the changes, and eventually, the Timberwolves began moving in a direction that made Cat feel less like the center of the future and more like a star being squeezed into someone else's plan. The Rudy Gobert trade changed everything. Minnesota gave up a massive package to bring in another center, and suddenly Towns was pushed away from his most natural position. He was still important, still talented, still capable of big nights, but the fit became awkward. Instead of being the offensive hub at center, he was asked to adjust around a big man who did not space the floor. The team wanted defense, size, and toughness, but the price was clarity. KAT had to sacrifice parts of his game so the experiment could work. Then Anthony Edwards exploded. Ant brought electricity. He had the charisma, the confidence, the highlight plays, and the fearless personality fans love. He became the new face of the franchise almost naturally. The cameras followed him. The national media embraced him. The locker room energy shifted toward him. And none of that meant Towns was useless. But it did mean the story had changed. For years, critics said Towns could not be the main guy. Now, when Minnesota finally looked dangerous, people credited Edwards as the engine and framed KAT as the supporting piece. Even when Towns helped the Wolves win, the conversation did not fully return to him. Instead, it hardened the old belief. Maybe he was never meant to lead. That had to sting. Because this was the same player who arrived as the #1 pick. The same player Kevin Garnett called the future. The same player who carried enormous expectations through losing seasons, roster changes, injuries, jokes, and endless criticism. But when the team finally became a real contender, the world acted like he was just along for the ride. That is how a relationship starts to fade. Not always through anger, not always through betrayal. Sometimes it fades when both sides simply stop seeing the same future. Minnesota had found a new identity. Edwards was the headline. Gobert was the defensive anchor. And Towns, once the symbol of everything the Timberwolves hoped to become, was suddenly the expensive question they had to answer. The trade that made everyone pick a side. When Karl-Anthony Towns was traded to the New York Knicks, the reaction was immediate and brutal. In theory, it should have felt like a fresh start. A star big man returning close to home, joining one of basketball's most passionate markets, playing beside Jalen Brunson on a team hungry for a championship push. But that was not the way most people framed it. Instead, they treated the move like a countdown to failure. The critics already had their arguments prepared. They said Madison Square Garden would expose him. They said New York fans would not tolerate the same mistakes Minnesota had lived with for years. They said his contract was too heavy, his defense too risky, his playoff resume too thin. Some called him the most expensive second option in the league. Others said the Knicks had just sacrificed toughness for talent, and almost everyone agreed on one thing. This was Brunson's team, and Towns would have to prove he could survive inside that reality. That was what made the trade so fascinating. For the first time in his career, KAT was not being asked to carry an entire franchise by himself. He was not walking into a young roster, still trying to find itself. He was joining a team with structure, identity, guards who could control the game, wings who could defend, and a city that demanded winning every single night. The pressure was bigger, but the role was cleaner, and that changed everything. Brunson gave New York leadership and late-game control. OG Anunoby and Mikal Bridges gave the Knicks length, discipline, and defensive credibility on the perimeter. That meant Towns did not have to be everything at once. He could focus on what made him special: spacing the floor, punishing mismatches, rebounding, passing from the high post, and forcing defenses into impossible decisions. Still, nobody wanted to give him credit too early. Every strong game was treated like a temporary hot streak. Every defensive mistake brought the old jokes back. Every quiet night led to the same question: is this really going to work? But inside the Knicks' system, something important was happening. Towns was not shrinking under the pressure. He was learning how to breathe inside it. For years, people judged him as a failed #1 option. In New York, he started showing the world what he looked like as the perfect championship co-star. And slowly, the laughter got quieter. New York finally gave KAT the role he needed. The biggest misunderstanding about Karl-Anthony Towns was that people kept asking whether he could be the face of everything. But the better question was always this: what happens when a player with his skill set is placed in the exact role that allows him to hurt defenses without carrying every burden alone? New York gave the league that answer. With the Knicks, Towns did not have to force the game. He did not need to dominate every possession to prove he belonged. He could pick his spots, he could stretch the defense from the top of the floor, he could pull opposing centers away from the rim, opening driving lanes for Brunson and creating space for New York's wings to cut, attack, and punish rotations. That one shift changed the entire offense. When Towns set screens, defenders had to make uncomfortable choices. If the big dropped back, KAT could pop out and shoot. If the defense switched, he could punish smaller players inside. If help came too aggressively, he could move the ball and keep the Knicks flowing. Suddenly, the same skills critics once treated like empty regular season tricks became weapons inside a winning system. And because New York had real perimeter defenders, Towns was not constantly left exposed. OG and Bridges handled brutal wing assignments. Brunson controlled tempo. The rest of the roster played with purpose. Instead of being asked to cover every weakness, KAT was finally surrounded by players who allowed his strengths to breathe. That is what people missed for years. Fit matters. Role matters. Environment matters. A player can look flawed in one situation and essential in another. Towns did not need people to lower expectation. He needed a team that understood how to use him. Once he got that, the story changed fast. The numbers were still strong, but the impact was bigger than the box score. His spacing opened the floor, his rebounding stabilized possessions, his passing gave the Knicks a different layer. His presence forced opposing coaches to rewrite defensive plans before every game. And most importantly, he looked comfortable. Not comfortable in a lazy way. Comfortable in the way a player looks when he finally knows exactly where he fits. That comfort became confidence. That confidence became rhythm. And that rhythm became danger. By the time the Knicks started stacking wins, the old conversation felt outdated. The same player people said would be swallowed by New York was now helping give the Knicks one of the most balanced attacks in basketball. He was not stealing Brunson's spotlight. He was making Brunson's job easier. He was not destroying the team's identity. He was expanding it. For the first time in years, Karl-Anthony Towns was not fighting the narrative. He was rewriting it, the system that unlocked the beast. When Mike Brown took over, he did not look at Karl-Anthony Towns as a problem to hide. He looked at him as a weapon to unlock. That difference may sound small, but for Cat's career, it was massive. For years, coaches and critics had focused on what Towns was not. Brown focused on what he could become if the offense treated him like more than a tall shooter. The Knicks began using Towns in layers. One possession, he was spacing the floor for Brunson. The next, he was catching at the elbow and reading the defense like a quarterback. Then came dribble handoffs, inverted pick and rolls, quick seals in the paint, trail threes in transition, and high post actions that turned him into the connector between every dangerous piece New York had. The ball no longer stuck. The offense no longer looked predictable. And KAT was not just finishing plays. He was shaping them. That is when his value became impossible to ignore. A traditional center can protect the rim, a stretch big can shoot, a scoring big can punish matchups, but Towns gave the Knicks pieces of all three while adding passing vision that made the entire team harder to guard. Defenses could not treat him like a role player. They could not sag off him. They could not switch without consequences. They could not double without opening something else. And the more New York trusted him, the more disciplined he became. He was no longer chasing numbers just to prove critics wrong. He was taking the right shots, making the right reads, and accepting that winning sometimes means dominating without forcing attention. That maturity mattered. It showed up in late game possessions. It showed up when Brunson drew traps. It showed up when role players needed clean looks. It showed up when the Knicks needed calm instead of chaos. For Kevin Garnett, this must have felt familiar. This was the beast he had talked about years earlier, but it did not look exactly how people expected. It was not just screaming, flexing, or trying to overpower everyone. It was patience. It was intelligence. It was growth. It was a star finally understanding that real dominance can come from making the whole team stronger. That is why the Knicks became so dangerous. They were not built around one simple formula. They could beat teams with Brunson's shot creation, with wing defense, with physical rebounding, with spacing, or with Towns pulling the entire defense out of position. Every game forced opponents to choose which problem they wanted to live with. And by the playoffs, there were no good choices left. The playoff run, that changed everything. The regular season made people pay attention, but the playoffs forced them to respect Karl-Anthony Towns. That was always the final test. Not January highlights, not all-star numbers. Not efficient shooting, splits against tired defenses in the middle of the schedule. The real question was whether Cat could bring value when every possession was scouted, every weakness was hunted, and every mistake became a national conversation. This time, he answered, New York entered the postseason with confidence, but also with pressure. The Knicks had waited decades for a team like this. Their fans did not want a nice story. They wanted proof. They wanted toughness. They wanted a group that could walk into hostile arenas and take control. And from the opening round forward, Towns gave them exactly what they needed. Some nights, it was scoring. He punished smaller defenders, stretched slower bigs, and kept defenses honest. Other nights, it was rebounding, ripping away second chances, and ending possessions when New York desperately needed stop. Then there were the quieter games, the ones casual fans might overlook, where his screens, spacing, and passing completely changed the rhythm of the offense. Those games mattered just as much, because in the playoffs, stars do not always win by putting up the loudest numbers. Sometimes they win by forcing the defense to make decisions it does not want to make. Towns did that over and over again. If teams loaded up on Brunson, KAT became the release valve. If they tried to stay home on shooters, he found space inside. If they attacked him defensively, he stayed composed and battled through possessions instead of letting the moment break him. That was the part critics did not expect. The same player they called soft was no longer reacting to pressure. He was absorbing it. Every series seemed to remove another piece of the old narrative. He was not too fragile for the moment. He was not too limited to survive playoff adjustments. He was not just a regular season star. He was a winning player on a winning team, doing winning things when the lights were brightest. And with every Knicks victory, Kevin Garnett's old words started echoing louder. The future, the beast, the special mentality. The things people laughed at were suddenly showing up on the biggest stage. By the time New York reached the finals, the conversation around KAT had completely shifted. People were no longer asking if he could help a contender. They were asking how anyone ever doubted it. Standing across from Wemby. The finals gave Karl-Anthony Towns the perfect stage for redemption because the matchup felt almost symbolic. On one side stood Victor Wembanyama, the newest face of basketball's future. The player fans and analysts had already placed in conversations bigger than his age. On the other side stood Towns, once called the future himself, but then buried under years of criticism, jokes, and doubt. It was almost like the league had written the scene on purpose. Everyone expected Wemby to own the spotlight. He was the highlight machine, the defensive monster, the impossible frame, the player people believed could redefine the sport, and to be clear, the attention made sense. But what made the moment so powerful was that Towns was not intimidated by it. He did not treat Wembanyama like a myth. He treated him like an opponent. That mattered. In Game 2 on the road, when San Antonio wanted momentum and the crowd was ready to explode, KAT delivered one of the most important performances of his career. He battled inside, he spaced the floor, he attacked the glass. He stayed physical without losing control. And when New York needed a response, he gave them 21 points and 13 rebounds. That stat line carried history with it. To become the first Knick since Dave DeBusschere in 1973 to post a 2-0-point double-double in a finals road game was not just a personal achievement. It connected Towns to the last great championship memory in Knicks history. For a franchise starving for that feeling, the moment felt bigger than one night. But the defense may have been even more. For years, that was where critics attacked him first. They said he could not hold up. They said he would be hunted. They said elite bigs would expose him when everything mattered. Against Wembanyama, Towns showed discipline, strength, positioning, and pride. He did not win every possession, because nobody does at that level, but he competed in a way that shattered the lazy version of his reputation. That is what changed the conversation. By the time the Knicks took control of the series, KAT was no longer being discussed as a risky contract or a questionable playoff piece. He was being viewed as one of the pillars of a championship team. Brunson may have been the engine, but Towns was the piece that made the machine nearly impossible to solve. The player once mocked for not being tough enough had stood across from basketball's newest giant and refused to blink. The ring, the lesson, and the words. KG waited 11 years to say. When the final buzzer sounded and the New York Knicks became champions, the celebration was about more than a trophy. It was about history. It was about a city waiting more than 5 decades to feel basketball glory again. It was about Jalen Brunson leading with control, the Wings defending with pride, the organization building a roster that finally made sense, and Karl-Anthony Towns standing in the middle of it all as proof that a player's story is never finished just because the public stops believing. Then the cameras found Kevin Garnett. For 11 years, KG had carried the same message. He said Towns had something special. He said the talent was real. He said the fire was there. He defended him when critics laughed, when fans mocked, when analysts reduced his career to flaws and failures. And after all that time, after all those debates, after all those seasons of being treated like the last believer on the island, Garnett finally had the moment he had been waiting for. I told y'all, that sentence carried the weight of a decade. But the deeper lesson was not just that Kevin Garnett was right. The lesson was that basketball judgment can be impatient. Too often, fans decide who a player is before the full story has been written. They confuse bad fit with bad character. They confuse playoff struggle with weakness. They confuse quiet growth with failure. Karl-Anthony Towns did not become a champion because he suddenly turned into someone completely different. He became a champion because the right environment finally revealed what had been there all along. That matters far beyond basketball. Sometimes people need time. Sometimes they need the right team, the right role, the right trust, and the right voices around them. Criticism can sharpen someone, but disrespect can also blind the world to what is still developing. Towns' journey reminds us that growth is not always loud, redemption does not always arrive quickly, and belief can look foolish for years before it finally looks like wisdom. Strategically, the Knicks showed the league something powerful. They did not ask every star to be the same, they built around balance. Brunson led, Towns stretched and connected, the Wings defended. The system protected weaknesses and amplified strengths. That is how great teams are built, not through ego, but through fit, sacrifice, patience, and trust. So now, Karl-Anthony Towns is not the punchline anymore. He is not just the player people doubted in Minnesota. He is an NBA champion, a central piece of one of the greatest redemption stories in modern basketball, and living proof that the world can be wrong for a very long time. If this story taught you something about patience, belief, and never writing people off too early, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with another NBA fan. Comment 1 if Kevin Garnett was right from day one. Comment 2 if Cat's ring changed your opinion. And tell us where you're watching from. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next NBA story.